Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Colman Noctor, and it's a real pleasure to get a chance to chat to you today. It's interesting. The PDST, an acronym, is interesting because I may well confuse it with PTSD, which is post traumatic stress disorder, rather than professional development, an acronym for teachers. So I hope I don't cause you any trauma or stress today as I give you this talk. Look, it's a real pleasure to get this opportunity, and thank you very much for the invite. I think the role of TY coordinator is a really interesting one. I'm fascinated by the concept of transition year as an entity. I've worked in child psychiatry for 25 years and working with children and families with mental health problems over that time. There's been many young people who I think have gained hugely from transition year. The experience has given them an opportunity to mature, to engage, to reflect, to maybe even take a break after a busy first 3 year adjustment to secondary school. And again, there are others who, maybe TY was the wrong choice or something. They dropped from momentum. Maybe it was a time where they became more distracted by things. And maybe it was a year that they just put in. And a large amount of that is the student's application to the concept of TY and how engaged and up for it they are. And also, I suppose, the culture of the school in terms of how meaningful the TY program is. And I don't envy anyone who's been a TY coordinator over the last number of years. The rolling lockdowns, COVID-19 pandemic, the challenges around trying to be creative in terms of making things interesting, the restrictions on group activities, on being on the premises, on being doing your away days. Everything has been so disrupted by the global pandemic that it has been next or near impossible to try and create a meaningful experience for students. And so I don't envy anyone with that task. And as we head into another term this year in 2021, the worries still remain around the disruption levels that may occur this time round. We are in the midst of a fourth wave. There is ever increasing numbers. We know we have vaccine rollouts, etc., which is an important kind of, I suppose, parameter in terms of looking and considering that. But that said, there are still massive worries and massive potential for disruption. And, as somebody who worked right the way through the first half of the pandemic in a child and adolescent inpatient unit where we were not able to allow the young people to leave the unit, they had no visitors, there was no activities, engaging young people in the treatment program in hospital was incredibly difficult for those number of months. And so I'm fully aware of those challenges, trying to keeping things fresh and meaningful and engaging when your limitation around how and what you can do is so great. But what I do believe is that, and I suppose it's a controversial issue. I mean, maybe preferentially, I would love to see TY as a concept, that transition year occur maybe between sixth class and first year. I think there's a huge leap that happens over that time. And I would love if we could maybe put those provisions or the spirit of the TY program in that space rather than when it arrives in fourth year. I think a lot of the challenges that you're left with in terms of that age group is trying to iron out some creases that have already occurred and maybe happened between the first and third year time spans. But it is an interesting point in their lives where they do become that young adult piece where the contemplation of the future, the contemplation of leaving cert cycle, and all of those things are starting to come into reality. And that important experience of getting some work experience and life experience and group projects, it really, to me, is about an experience of almost a reflection of real life. And as well as it being kind of an experience of the joy that life brings us, it can also and should also be a lesson in terms of how maybe at times life is unfair. And I don't mean that to be overly glum. I think as we grow older, we start to realize that, all is not what it may have thought to have been. I always make the point that, the 4-year-old thinks they're Spider-Man, the 8-year-old starts to worry that everyone else thinks they're Spider-Man, and the 12-year-old realizes they're not Spider-Man. and the 16-year-old realizes they never will be. And again, that process of kind of disillusionment is part of growing up and part of that cusp of becoming adulthood and then entering into young adulthood. And, depending on how we look at young people, they're either old children or young adults. And again, the way in which we maybe treat them is culturally important in determining who they become. But I digress. In terms of trying to create a meaningful TY program, I mean, I would think I'm not going to be able to tell you the practical things of what you should do, but I think there's a spirit or a culture of a TY program that would be useful, and where I would say, I think perhaps where the need is in the area of mental well-being. And lots of things, we know that well-being is a big feature of programs at the moment, and we have curriculum dedicated to it, etc. But the issue around mental well-being is that we use the term a lot, but we don't actually know what it means. And so if you ask a lot of young people, and I've given talks to a lot of young people, especially transition year, what is mental health and well-being? And they will say it's happiness, right? So if it's being happy, then what does happy mean? What does it look like? And then I would show them this slide and say, is this happy? And many of them would say yes. And then the next question I ask is, how much of your life do you feel that you do or should spend like this? You might be surprised to know that the answers generally are between 70 and 90%. And that's the expectation, that we would spend 70 or 90% of our lives happy. And the next slide that I show them is this one, which is a bit interesting. It is that we probably spend less than 1% of our lives happy. And the rest, the other 99%, is a kind of a content disgruntlement. But if the problem is, if our desire is to be happy all the time, then we will spend 99% of our lives disappointed. And that's the issue here, is that perhaps there is an expectation of what happiness is that is unrealistic and unhelpful. And the next question is resilience. How do we encourage resilience? And resilience is a constantly misunderstood phrase as well. Resilience means the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness, right? So then we have to ask, well, what qualifies as difficulties? What is a challenge? Maybe what a child in the 1950s considered as difficult, considering versus a child in 2021 might be very different. But it is a case that the easier we have it, the harder the simple things become. And so, by means of our culture, and I think a lot of our culture plays into our resiliency or lack of resiliency in our culture of children and young people, is that it drives our expectations. It says that we should never be bored, you should never be sad, you should never be unhappy, you should never be. And what we're doing is we're setting this really high parameter for what consists of success and failure. And for me, many young people believe that 9 to 10 is success, but everything below 9 is failure. And I would see the TY experience as a real opportunity to kind of clarify that and give them a more realistic spectrum of success and failure that includes a 1 to 10 phenomenon as opposed to that. A contemporary kind of example of this observation of resilience, previously when we would be doing mental health assessments, accustomed to assessing for a source of difficulty. So usually in the context of an adverse life event. So it could be extensive bullying, there could be bereavement, there could be loss or trauma, family acrimony, whatever it might be. And there's usually this sort of collateral history that would kind of reveal why that person is presenting you in the way that they're sad or anxious. However, what currently we're observing is that levels of anxiety, worry, and sadness appear without and in the absence of such trauma. So these young people have kind of, very simply put, I can remember speaking to a 17-year-old who had made a very serious attempt on her life. And again, I was kind of going forensically through her history to try and find out what this was about. And she said, there's nothing in my history, Colman. She said, I'm here and I'm looking at this. She says, what has life got for me? She said, next year I'm going to do my leaving cert. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to probably get a job. I'll probably meet someone, get married, have a few kids, and I'll die. And she said, that's not enough for me. And, my first instinct was, you've just kind of described my life as something that is, worthless. But from the point of view, the second piece is, this is her reality. This isn't an issue with trauma. This is an expectation of reality. Her expectation of where she wants to be is not where she is. And we can classify that and say, well, this is just millennial entitlism or whatever it might be. But the reality is that her sadness was real. Her disappointment was authentic, not because her life had been very difficult, but because her expectation of life had been unrealistic. And I really do believe that there's an opportunity for us to address that, address the expectation. The assumption, therefore, is that children nowadays lack resilience. They can't seem to cope with normal life events, and they get the narrative around snowflakes and indulged, etc. But however, maybe they're a product of a value system that has been created for young people by adults. And I use the example of the world in which they live in, the world in the culture, is that our expectations of reality are different. We've never had more mental health awareness campaigns than we do now. We've never had more people out talking in schools, giving webinars, well-beings, etc. Yet we've never been more unhappy, and there's never been a more demand on services than there is now. And why is that happening? What's that about? Why is our culture so unhealthy when it comes to a mental health point of view? Well, the two main culprits for this phenomenon are thought to be technology, like the Instagram social media side of things, and overparenting. That children now are kind of living in a situation where parents are helicoptering or making decisions for them and not allowing them to experience adversity. And so when adversity inevitably strikes, they're unable to cope with it. But there's also the issue of expectation. And I would show that, we could, the idea of technology being, the ruination of childhood or teenage years is overhammed in that way, but it's also misunderstood. We think about cyberbullying, or we think about pornography, or we think about the kind of gambling or whatever it is, that these kind of thin end of the wedge. But technology affects our mental health much more subtle ways than that. And I use the example of going to, this is pre-COVID, going to a Circle K station once, and I went to pay for something, and the girl behind the counter said, I'm sorry, sir, the tap is broken. And then she proceeded to apologize again, which must have meant that my face had given away some form of horror or disgruntlement. And it was like I was kind of saying to her, you mean I have to press 4 buttons? And the issue was I pressed 4 buttons on that machine 6 months before that without a problem. But now it had become a problem. And that's what I mean by the easier things become, the harder things appear. That's not necessarily that our realities are worse, but our expectations of reality are. And again, that is down to a kind of a viewpoint of that everything should be perfect, everything should be right. And perfectionism is an epidemic when it comes to teenage girls. I think in terms of, we live in a culture where they can edit, paste, Photoshop, filter, and they need to have this perfect product all the time. And I think it creates much more pressure, creates an unrealism, and obviously creates more disappointment and unhappiness. Very simple, kind of, for me, a very simple formula or algorithm for happiness is expectation minus reality equals happiness. And I feel if we are to use transition year to meaningfully address some of the issues in our culture, then it is to realign or refocus the lens of expectation, more in line with our reality, and therefore creating less potential for unhappiness, if that makes sense. The differing narratives around generational relationships is, those born in the 50s and 70s are raised to expect practical, secure careers with economic security. But in the 90s, the world entered a time of economic prosperity. And so these are the parents of the children, myself included, who are there. And, in terms of how things have changed, the message of if you work hard, good things will happen was probably the message that I maybe grew up with. However, things have changed, in terms of the Instagram side of things would say, you can have anything you want if you're willing to give up the belief that you can't have it. Now, if that's the message that our young people are hearing from this, you can have anything you want if you're willing to give up the belief that you can't have it, that's not reassuring. That's pressure. And I think there's an opportunity for us to create a counter narrative to that in actual fact, you can't have anything you want just because you're willing to give up. The belief will get you so far, and it's really important, but it doesn't mean that you're entitled to it or that it will happen. What we do is we create an unrealistic desire and an unrealistic reality. And that can be a real challenge for young people. And again, a kind of a learning curve. It's a confusing message. we all want, prosperity and security, but we also want to be ambitious and enjoy our lives. And I think one of the other messages that children and young people have heard is that you're special, and we've all maybe told our children that. But by the reality, that's just simply not true. If everyone is special, then no one is special. So by definition, it wouldn't mean anything. And instilling a belief in invincibility as you grow up is really important in the early parts of our childhood. It protects your self-worth during the innocence of childhood, but it needs to be weaned back as we enter adulthood. And this is where the transition year is really important. Instilling a belief in what is possible, but neglecting to mention that it might be difficult, laborious, slow, that's a problem. If it doesn't fit in with the technology narrative, which is about speed, convenience, gratification. And this really should be about fulfillment. And that's where I think the TY opportunity is, to shift that focus of the dial from gratification to fulfillment. I can go to the gym for 9 hours today, and I will look no different after the 9 hours as I went in. However, if I go to the gym for 30 minutes 3 times a week for 6 months, then I will notice a difference. It's not about the one-off, quick fix, short fix effort. That's gratification. And technology is a very gratification-focused thing. Order now, get it tomorrow. Press this, get that. The idea of fulfillment is much more about labor. It's about value. It's about meaning. And I would think that there's a real unique opportunity in the TY experience to shift that, to shift it from expectation to reality, because what it does is it leaves us frustrated and disappointed. And that's what many of the young people that come to me are experiencing. And how does technology affect resilience? I mean, that's an unusual thing. As I say, we shape our buildings and they shape us. So it gets back to that idea of me and in the Circle K station and the tap, the comparative culture of desire. Never before have we been able to compare ourselves as much as we can to other people, which means that we're constantly being exposed. And this chap on the left-hand side was delighted with his kind of rocket ice pop until he saw this lady with her massive cone. And so from the point of view, if you're constantly being exposed to that, there's never a point at which enough exists. Our enough keeps moving. It's the first time we've lived in a prefigurative society. It's never happened before, where the young teach the old. And this is where technology comes into it. Traditionally, we would say as adults, this is a motor car, you need to treat it this way and drive it this way, and it'll be safe. But now we have children teaching older people about technology. And so it's no wonder that our usage of technology is infantile in many ways in terms of how we do that. The tyranny of choice. And young people have never had more options. More options don't reduce anxiety, they create it. It fuels perfectionism, rumination. There's more of a risk of making the wrong choice. And then obviously the knowledge of other people's choices creates uncertainty as well. And so removing the tyranny of choice means that removing that idea that I'll get it perfect. And again, many of us have probably scrolled through Netflix for 30 minutes trying to decide what to watch without actually watching anything at all, rather than back in the day when you would have gone down to Chartbusters, got the movie, walked home, and kind of sat with it for a little while and go, this is a slow burner, but I'll persevere with it. There is no need for perseverance in this culture, and therefore it's a skill set that we don't necessarily develop. The illusion of control and desire. This is, the more drafts I write, the better the email will sound, when in actual fact, the reality is there's no pressure, there's just no excuses, there's just rumination and endless preparation. And again, that idea of there's no enough. The other thing is the on-demand culture. Children are sold an idea of on-demand happiness. In their narratives, all you can eat data, binge watch, all this sort of stuff celebrates excess and normalizes excess as being something normal. And we need to really address that for young people, and kind of address the need that in actual fact, excess is not good. In actual fact, it's something much more middle is where we need to be. And the ability to bypass experiences that build core emotions, like never having to learn to wait, again, creates that gratification focus. And the idea of the concept of enough has been lost. And that's a real, I would love to use a TY year to reflect on enoughness, to reflect on fulfillment, to reflect on value. These are kind of core concepts that are not part of the everyday dynamic, and again, even in schools, we sometimes mirror that, where we give prizes for the brightest kid, the fastest kid, the sportiest kid, and the kid who's best at chess or whatever it might be. we don't tend to celebrate things like the kindest kid, the most generous kid, the kid who overcame diversity, the person who lost a parent this year, the person, these are other areas in which we as a school could really create a culture of focusing on the other elements rather than just the fastest, best, and brightest. Technology mediates our desire, manipulates our expectations. As I said, the algorithms of, essentially children are living in a town that's where the town planners are Google and Apple, and it's all about desire. It's about giving you what you want and not giving you what you need. And there's no ethical consideration in this town and village. It's not that it's if you want more casinos, we'll build more casinos. And if you just keep wanting casinos, then we won't put in street lighting or sanitation or disabled parking because you don't want it. It's a desire. It's a world where we're given what we want, not what we need. And again, this opportunity of TY would be a beautifully reflective piece of them getting in touch again with what is the difference between want and need. And if you could cover that from a mental well-being point of view, it'd be hugely important. And, even if we cleaned up the technology and we had no pornography, no gambling, no illegal stuff, you'd still have that kid who'd spend, 8 hours on YouTube watching cats on skateboards, not because there's anything illegal or inappropriate about that. That's not about regulating content. That's about regulating human desire. And again, it's about kind of getting in touch with that. And I think in terms of that gratification, fulfillment, focus, trying to, there's so many steps that we're missing because the world's moved so fast. I really see an opportunity in the TY experience to slow it down, to address those bits, those developmental, and really working on emotional intelligence and social intelligence and really creating opportunities for interaction. We talk a lot about it's good to talk. We're told we need to be more emotionally expressive, and it's very gratifying to get something off your chest. However, emotional expression must be accompanied by emotional intelligence, which is the idea of knowing how to read a room, needing to kind of tune into my own emotions and tune into the emotions of others. If you have a world where everyone is just encouraged to be emotionally expressive without being emotionally intelligent, you'll have something like Twitter, which is where people are just saying, I have feelings, and they're shouting and roaring their feelings around the place without actually having perhaps the emotional intelligence to understand what they are. So when we get back to resilience, how do we help young people to develop an emphasis on emotional expression? The era of constantly being distracted, they're constantly agitated. Their desire and vulnerability is being kind of poked at all the time. We need to understand, what nurtures and compromises our resilience. And for me, the always on is more than we can handle. So if we had something in the TY curriculum that, allows them to switch off, we live in an anti-reflection culture where we're taught to just act, do fast. And again, kind of encouraging reflection. I don't mean this in a spiritual way, but things like the traditional retreat that we used to do when we were in school has kind of died a death, I think, in that way. But there's never been more of a time for some sort of a retreat, not from a spiritual point of view, but merely a time for an out and a discussion and a reflection and a critique of where we're at and what we want from our lives. And I think young people really would benefit from that. Mindfulness over mindlessness. I think mindfulness has become popular because we live in a mindless society where we're not encouraged to reflect and think. And again, anything that develops their sense of self is really important. How do we learn to regulate our own desire? Well, establishing a good sense of self is key to that. Who am I? What do I want? Rather than being determined by what Twitter wants or what Instagram tells me to want, it's what do I need for myself? And this need to invest in determining your own values, your own priorities, what's meaningful to you, and not having that decided by others would be really crucial. The technology are they are the weapons of mass distraction. They teach us to not reflect. They know our vulnerabilities, and the algorithms kind of prey on those. And so young people are living through a really tough time. But the most important relationship they or us or anyone will ever have in your life is your relationship with yourself. And I think any TY program that includes an opportunity to get to know yourself would be really useful. And again, resilience is not born out of adversity and toughness. It's not about, I've had the hardest life, so I'm the most resilient. It's created through a good sense of who I am that reflects authenticity and accuracy. It's not about having false beliefs around my own ability, but it's also about knowing my value and my worth in terms of my meaningfulness. And the identity and sense of self is crucial. to our mental well-being. It's a crucial value system which gives us meaning and purpose in our lives. And I think trying to invest in that, and that was my laboratory of life, was the 65 bus. I got that to school every day and from school every day. And I learned on that bus journey about life, intimacy, growing up, maturity, that social experiment of being with other people. And again, I would say to you, be very mindful that young people who are coming into your class now in fourth year were second years when lockdown started, from the point of view of the gap between a second year and a fourth year is massive, and they may be coming to you with a degree of arrest, of developmental arrest, where these identity and sense of self have not been able to be delivered. So what can we do? First, it's about learning to regulate our own desire. It's about saying, I don't always need to. What's the difference between a want and a need, and how do I tune into it? And how do I know what it is that I'm choosing to do, whether somebody is telling me to do that? We need to be critical consumers of technology and question it and say it's not neutral, and realign our value systems. And that's the really important part, is to try and get their value systems in order. If I was designing my curriculum around TY this year, I'd be looking at these counter narratives. So in a culture of online pornography, we need to be talking about intimacy and consent. In a culture that's so much outcome focused, we need to acknowledge what it is to be effort focused. In a culture of outrage, we need to instill calm. In a culture that's so sensitive to offense, we need to instill balance. And in a culture of distraction, we need to instill space. And again, these are kind of just building in these opportunities to have conversations, to have time together, to have connectedness. The technology is not going away. It's not another fad that will pass. This isn't the Soda Stream, the Lolo Ball, or the Tamagotchi. This is something that will be here to stay. And I think we need to try and manage that. But what I will say to you, and I'll finish on this, the jar of stones is a concept that I believe is really important to any of us to learn. And if this was something that you could get across to your students over TY, I think it'd be really useful. The jar of stones is where a philosophy lecturer comes into a class, and he fills a jar full of rocks, and he asks the class, "Is it full?" And they said, "Yeah." And then he gets some pebbles and he sprinkles them in between the rocks, and he says, "Now is it full?" And they said, "Yes." And then he gets some sand and he sprinkles between the rocks and the pebbles. He says, "Now is it full?" And they said, "Yes." And he said, that represents a fulfilled and meaningful life. The rocks are the most important things, like your health, your family, and your close and intimate friendships. The pebbles are the secondary important things, like the grades you get, your work ethic, etc. And the sand is the cosmetic rubbish that's really not that important at all, around what labels you wear, how many followers you have, or how filtered your Instagram page is. And he basically said that in order to have balance and resilience, you must put the rocks in first, and then the pebbles, and then sand. Otherwise, you have this. And this is the risk, I feel, that our culture is selling our children and our young people sand. It's telling them, this is important. You need to have this, you need to have that. If we fill our lives up with sand, we will not have room for rocks and pebbles. And so if you are to be resilient, the resilient among us know what their rocks are, what their pebbles are, and what is sand. And your ability to be able to differentiate and distinguish between those three things allows you to build a resilient mindset, that you don't sweat the small stuff. And so if I had a goal for TY, as a TY coordinator, I want my students to come out of this year having one identification of what is their rock, what is their pebble, and what is their sand. And if you have that and they're able to accordingly prioritize their lives in that way, by default, they will be resilient individuals. But again, that's easier said than done. But I think it should be an emphasis of your well-being endeavors, and I really, really wish you well in it. I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this. I believe you're doing something very, very challenging in really difficult times. But the things that we've spoken about there today, you don't need an outing for that. You don't need a trip to Delphi, or you don't need an overnight, or you don't need. What you need is young people who are culturally open to the idea of engaging meaningfully in trying to understand themselves a little bit better. I think the first to third year gallop is a bit of a sprint. I think the fifth and sixth year is a very academically focused time. And so that fourth year out is really about kind of consolidating their own value systems, trying to get a good sense of who they are. And they get that through each other. Children and young people who have, these TYs coming in, as I say, left in second year. They've missed out on junior cert experience. They've missed out on a state exam. They've missed out on many kind of badge of honor milestones, in terms of rite of passages over the last 2 years. And they will be more immature. They will struggle with the pace of things, and they may need to have a system of education that is flexible. But I would say to you, first and foremost, the culture is the most important thing. And people ask me all the time, Colman, is that a good school or not? And I would always say, it could be a great school. It could be the best school in the world. But that third year group are particularly difficult or particularly toxic. Or you might say, this is a really, this school has a very unsavory, reputation and not great. But that second year group are wonderful to each other, and they're really supportive of each other and everything else. So when you're getting your TY going, the culture in which you can get the people to engage and apply and have an optimism around and buy into it, have an ownership over how the TY goes, give them some responsibility around the choices of what it is that they want to do, involve them in the decision making. But building on their sense of self, building on their priorities, their values, their connections, allowing them a kind of a social opportunity to share ideas, to critique things, to question things, would, for me, be supporting them to be best placed as they leave being big children and they come into TY as big children and leave there as little adults, or old children and young adults. There is a real responsibility on TY coordinators, and it's an honor and a privilege to be in the position to be able to utilize the time. And I think if we focus on how do we fill time rather than how do we create meaning, we miss a real window to actually change people's lives. And what I would say to you is, where lots of young people come to me, and school is the source of the worries, whether it be bullying or learning difficulties or challenges around that, there are many young people who come to me and say that the relationships with a teacher, a coordinator, a guide, a mentor saved their lives. And for that, I would always encourage you all to remember that, as Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility, and that listening ear, that authenticness and that realness to hear what these young people have to say, to guide them and to give them license and permission to be honest and authentic and real, would be giving them a gift that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. So look, that's all from me. I wish you very, very well, and I hope the year goes well for you all. And again, thank you ever so much for listening, and take care. Bye bye.